I was just telling a story this morning. I had the opportunity to talk to a family over the holidays whose son, he has Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, and he'd been treated with gene therapy. And she started telling this story about a family dinner at a restaurant with a big extended family. And she said the doors of the restaurant were really heavy. And I thought, I don't describe a lot of my restaurant meals that way.
Yeah.
That's an interesting insight. And then she went on to say after dinner, their little guy pushed open that heavy door and ran into the parking lot. And the
But
rest
that's
of
what they remember.
and the rest of the family sort of, screamed because this little boy's running into a parking lot. And she and her husband looked at each other and cried. And they said, we never thought we'd have to teach him not to run into a parking lot.
Oh.
And I mean, it just gives me chills.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Building the Noise podcast.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Building the Noise podcast. I'm Matt Toresco, where on the Building the Noise podcast, we're all about building the noise to help patients get the help that they need. With me today is Wendy Erler, a mid-sized biotech patient advocate. And Wendy, to get started, I wanted to start with, why do you do what you do?
Well, that's probably the easiest question for me to answer. I feel honored and privileged that I really found my purpose within this incredibly meaningful career in biotech and pharmaceuticals. But I do this work specifically around patient affairs and patient advocacy because it just became clear to me very early that behind every diagnostic odyssey and disease journey is a person who felt very unheard, likely scared, had to learn a whole new scientific language, a family searching for answers. And once you become a patient or a caregiver, you really have to learn to navigate a whole new world and potentially thinking about a new future. So leading patient advocacy for me has always meant standing in that space between the science and the humanity and empathy, and refusing to let either exist without the other. And what I've learned is it's actually fundamental in listening with compassion, then translating what we hear and learn and turning that into what can we do to drive meaningful change or advance progress. That really is hope for many people, particularly in the areas which I work in, which are all rare disease.
Sure. You had referenced here, behind every diagnostic or behind every diagnostic odyssey is a patient. And I've been on that side where you don't feel like someone's listening to you. What's your advice to patients as they go through that to ensure that they feel heard?
I think that's really the hardest part, because what happens in that part of the experience, that, really that journey to being heard and getting answers, is connecting a lot of what seems like disparate symptoms. And our health system is not organized to connect those. It's really organized to, oh, you've got a stomach pain, go to GI. You've got a head pain, go to neurology. But the reality is it's this complex system of experiences that are happening within a family. And I really believe it's mom and dad seeing things and connecting those dots. And they just have to be willing to be vocal, and it's a fight. And it shouldn't be, but it is.
Sure.
Also found, anytime we can empower people to go talk to more specialists and really seek out those answers and not take, something at face value, it helps, because they really are put in a position of having to advocate for themselves. I've never met a family, though, that can't tell you the exact date and time that they got a diagnosis.
That's really powerful that they remember the exact date and time, because I can imagine that those are powerful moments for these families. You had referenced listening with compassion. And I think so much of the system, as you've discussed, wants to treat or wants to do something. What are your thoughts on how we can better listen with compassion? May we be parents and our children are the ones that are coming to us, or we be clinicians or part of pharma or biotech? How can we best listen with that compassion?
I think it's so simple in some ways. At the end of the day, we're all people. Whatever part of this healthcare system we find ourselves in, whether it's as a patient or caregiver, or on the medical team, or in drug development. We're all people. And I really think creating that space to listen is so important. And that's what we've done by emboldening this field of patient advocacy. And I tell my team all the time, you are that conduit of listening in that middle space, between drug development and drug approvals and all those important things we do. But I also fundamentally believe that we have to believe what we hear. And so it really does require active listening and understanding that patients and families are experts in their own experience, and their voices deserve to shape solutions that are meant for them. But it's hard. I mean, these are complex lives that everybody's living. And so, but if we fundamentally believe equity in healthcare starts with being seen, we all have a responsibility to listen.
Fundamentally believe that equity belongs to all in healthcare. I love that. So you had said we're all people. Let's go back a little bit then. Let's think about your current role, and how do you describe, let's say to your boys, for example, how do you describe to them what you do?
That's a funny question, because in my house, my children would, if someone asks them what I do, they say two things. I pretend to be a doctor in real life, and I drag them to a lot of awareness and fundraising events. But I think really what they've seen over the years is this opportunity to lead with compassion and to raising voices of people that may be unheard otherwise. And they've been able to see that firsthand. But I also think that I've been really proud to share with them the advances that we've made in the drug development pharmaceutical business. We are really driving so much innovation in science that's changing lives, and I'm proud to be a small part of that.
Sure. So you've recognized that this is a place that you wanted to be. When did you first identify that this role even existed? Because I think so many people come up in industry and they may hear about people involved in drug development and think of medical, or they might think of, the outreach to the community, but they don't know that patient advocacy is a thing. How did you come across this in your career, and what made you take that step?
I feel very fortunate because I found my purpose early. And by early, I was leading carnivals to raise money for awareness for muscular dystrophy when I was in 4th grade.
Wow.
I, really got to be part of this grassroots effort of helping others and raising awareness. And years later, when I first joined the pharmaceutical industry, I really understood that I had an opportunity to do a couple of things simultaneously. Use my, brain and smarts and communicate complex science and understand the possibilities. But at the same time, I knew from the beginning that core to everything we were doing were patients and families. And so when I started in this work, it wasn't formally called patient advocacy or patient centricity or any of the words we use.
Yeah.
But I found myself in leadership positions where I was able to articulate, we need to organize around this concept, which means we need to build capability that's different for patient advocacy than capability for medical or legal or finance. All are equally important. But if you're not hiring the right people and organizing around the opportunity to deliver from a patient advocacy perspective, it's a big gap. And we know the data. We know involving patients early and often actually brings efficiencies to organizations and improves culture. But we have a long way to go in really contextualizing that as a critical business strategy. And that's the work I've dedicated myself to.
Sure. So let's touch on two of those elements. Number one, you talk on building the capability. For the last, I would say 3 years, the industry as a whole has kind of ebbed away from its desire for patient advocacy. And then we'll see 3 years later, it comes back. How do we best help leaders recognize what it is that we do, but even more so, as you've talked about, recognize the value of pursuing engagement early?
Yeah, And I think I've seen three things happen. And if these three things are true, you get to a place where this work is impactful and meaningful much faster. And the first thing, in my opinion, that I've seen really drive early kind of collective buying into the concept of having an actual patient advocacy function to do the work is tone at the top.
Mm,
Board and the CEO believe that this is a critical strategic imperative for the organization, and that message and that investment is coming from the top. We can pivot and work so much smarter and faster. The second is really having leadership alignment that this work is unique and different and has a different trajectory of impact. So we're not talking about quarterly impact or quarterly KPIs. We're talking about building trust over the long term and how you report metrics. We all need to do that in business, but what's the right time? What's the right metric? And then the third is really building this belief and showing that by investment and actions and impact that this work is not just a nice to have, but a critical to have. And you wouldn't start any drug development program without a cross-functional group of people at the table. That's everything from pharmacokinetics
mm,
to biomarker development. If you don't have somebody who has the capability and skill working patient advocacy at the table, you're creating that gap, and then you have to play catch up. So it really is embedding all along. But my new hot button is we can't forget on the other end. If we're fortunate enough that drug development proceeds and medicines are approved, it's as important to continue that work in that setting where access becomes critical, but also continuing to share data and information and engagement with the patient community is more critical. And so it's the whole continuum.
sure. I mean, in your experience, having worked at organizations where I'm sure the top was in and the top was out, what do some of those measurements or how do you get your senior leadership to come on board and say, what can we expect or what should we expect?
Yeah, and I think it's asking that question. Being able to sit down with senior leaders and saying, what do you think you expect? What does that look like? What do I need to come back and report to you so you see the success and continue for us to be able to invest and expand? And then having that alignment up front. In a recent experience, I was building a global team from the ground up, and we aligned on what needed to be true at the end of year one, true at the end of year three, and true at the end of year five.
That's great.
Building blocks. But to be able to deliver on those commitments, I had to commit to building frameworks that spoke the language of the business. We're a data-driven, science-driven organization, so I needed to be able to come back with data. So we actually built the framework first and then hired the people to execute. And what I saw in a very relatively short amount of time is with these frameworks in place, all of a sudden the rest of the organization was also doing the work in the same way. So we were able to have a collective language when we came back to leadership of this is what we did, this was the impact, this is where we learned lessons, these are the gaps.
Sure. So you had referenced here doing that work of laying the groundwork for where we're going to be and what we want to be able to bring back. But you had also referenced that, you have to build the capability around the right people. So as you transition from that, okay, here's where we plan on going and we have buy-in there. What do you most look for in people as perhaps someone might be looking to join patient advocacy, but don't quite know what skills they need to have with them?
I build intentionally diverse teams, and I really like people coming with different backgrounds because the work in patient advocacy is enterprise-wide and very variable depending on the conditions you're working in. So I've hired people who were previous MSLs. I've hired people who led this work maybe at a CRO. I've hired people that came from advocacy organizations and had executive director type leadership. So the actual background to me is, what have you learned? What leadership skills have you demonstrated? But it's the soft skills that I think are more important. There's a lot I can teach about the business. I can't teach people how to show up for patients and how to meet them where they are and how to be empathetic. So empathetic leadership is really important to me. And then being able to come back and translate what you've heard and turn that into insights that drive impact is a big, important skill set. And I think that's where the value comes in. If we can believe that patient verbatims are data and some of the most important data we have, we can drive change.
Yeah. So as you think about, you talked about these soft skills, and I think that in a AI driven world, they're becoming more and more valuable, right? But I think even at the clinician level, soft skills are extremely important. So as you look to build your team, are there any specific soft skills that you recommend or that stand out to you in the world that we're in right now?
I think that what I look for and what I believe is that real impact doesn't come from having the right answer, but from taking the time to truly hear people's lived experiences.
Mm,
And when we take a minute to listen without rushing to fix or explain, and we really intentionally work to build trust, that's when you uncover what actually matters. And then we all make better decisions on both sides, right? Families are better informed, physicians are better informed. We're making the right decisions within industry and bringing the right information and medicines to people. So it fundamentally, in a lot of ways, the most meaningful progress starts with humility and curiosity. And by being in that place and being willing to start there, I'm astounded at how much I've learned. I
mm,
also we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and there's so much about this. If we would just start there and listen and see what that white space is. Most of these patient advocacy organizations have done a lot of the work for us. They know the natural history, they know the disease, they know what families need. We have to go in seeing them as an expert part of that stakeholder ecosystem, the way we consider HCPs, payers, regulators
mm.
to be experts. And so if we can start there, I think we move faster.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you referenced earlier that uh, your expectation is to be a part of the conversation early on to, let's say, phase 4, and truly being partners. In the work that we're brought in to do, in the market research that we do, we see that up to 93% of the nonprofit community, the disease state advocates, want to be involved early in that phase 1, phase 0 discussion. But unfortunately, from industry's perspective, we're only at about, I would say, 83, well, based off the data, 83% don't engage until 18 months from their PDUFA date. So how do we change that paradigm?
So that gets back to you're organized to deliver the results you get. So if you don't have a functional group leading patient advocacy to be able to execute on that commitment to engage early, you won't engage early. So it does require investment and having a seat at the table. And then those proof points of we heard this early, we did this with this information, and the outcome was this. That really helps us build that framework for the future. But you have to have the people to be able to do the work. And it can't just be an afterthought. We have to be embedded in that process early.
Sure.
I do think that's an area where rare disease has been a leader. Um, but doing that work at scale is equally as important in that, bigger population diseases. And we all have to agree that it is a driver of the science and a driver of the outcomes we're trying to get. I'm more concerned about the other end now as
Yeah.
burden is put on families to be the experts and to have all the information and come into their doctor's appointments well informed, that we have to continue to deliver that scientific exchange for families that doesn't get viewed as promotional, that there
Sure.
really is an opportunity to continue to share the data that comes out. So I think it's both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
It requires having those expert teams in place. We're always probably going to be a very small team comparatively across an organization. But if you can't invest in building that capability, we won't be able to deliver on this work.
Yeah. So as you think about the work that you've done with leaders within companies that you've been a part of, what is that compliment that you've gotten that okay, we're finally getting people to recognize that this matters?
It's funny. I didn't know you were going to ask that, but the way I describe it is when I walk into the room at my company, everyone's like, oh, Wendy's here. We have to think about the patient. Success to me is when that's happening when I'm not in the room.
There you go.
It's not a super strategic answer, but you know it when you see it. And if you think back to how do you make this real? How do you make patient centricity more than words on a wall? It is creating the work structure to be able to do the work. So if you have specific kind of scalable, reproducible models to do the work, teams start to see that that is the way of working and then they deliver.
Mhm.
So, for example, we started a program. Tufts University wrote a paper several years ago called Patient Friction Coefficient. And it was about looking at the burden we ask participants in clinical trials to undergo. And so we took that paper and we designed an internal working model to assess the burden for each of our clinical trials. And the concept is if you're enrolling people in a study who are ages 18 to 65, a 64-year-old is going to have a different experience than a 19-year-old, no matter what the condition or
Yeah.
the intervention. But if you can make that least burdensome for most participants from the outset, it'll be a more successful trial. So we were able to lead this work and show what mattered to potential participants, what changes we made in the protocol to deliver on this commitment, and then how that helped with enrollment. And in fairly short order, that became the way of working for the development teams. So it's not that advocacy washes their hand and walks
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
That's a fine oiled process. So
Sure.
now we can go attack something else. And I think that's where, to me, the success is in everybody across the organization, no matter what their function, is working from that type of perspective.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're describing here with regards to that strategic mindset of, there's been plenty published on X. Let's bring that in. Let's identify by going and listening to the patient community that we serve, what these problems are that they face. Because we hear all the time that we'd love to be involved in a phase 0, phase 1 approach, or at least be at the seat before, be in the table before, at the table before you go to fill your phase 3 trial. Because as you referenced here, everyone's going to have different experiences when it comes to looking at joining a trial and what barriers there are, or what a barrier might be to different types of patients. How do you best recommend others that are going through this struggle right now of maybe just engaging late, get those leaders to think about this differently?
I think we have to bring everybody to the same table. And that's still a huge opportunity. And by everybody, can you imagine meetings where you have the decision-making leaders of a drug development and commercial company at the same table as patient leaders, regulators, payers, and physicians?
Yeah.
Think we still have an opportunity to build that ecosystem. There are a lot of rooms where it's patient advocacy organizations and regulators in a meeting, or the company and regulators in a meeting. How often are we all at the same table? And to me, that's the goal we need to be striving for. And I really believe, as much as I can expose my leadership to the patient advocacy organization communities, so leaders in the space who are actually driving research, drug development, access, policy.
Yeah.
The credibility is so obvious immediately, but it's my job to make sure my leaders have exposure to that at
Sure.
the times. And I think that's a huge part of our responsibility.
Yeah, I've seen that happen once in my career. Ultimately, it was because of a rare disease patient advocacy organization that pulled those team members together. So you had heads of medical, heads of academic centers, KOLs in that space. This was SYNGAP 1, so extremely, extremely rare. And I can remember vividly when they got done with their presentations around all the new science and what was coming and a cure for this and a cure for that. And then they asked for input from the parents. The parents' feedback was, listen, a cure sounds great, but we worry every day that seizure that our child has is going to be the last time we get to hold them. And that you could have heard a pin drop in that room because everyone was looking way down the road and the parents were 5 steps in front of them. How do you build that connectivity so that we don't get lost with each other?
There's a lot of data on the power of effective storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, again, privileged space that I get to sit in. I hear the stories, and then it's my responsibility to share them in the right way with the right people. And I was just telling a story this morning. I had the opportunity to talk to a family over the holidays whose son, he has Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, and he'd been treated with gene therapy. And she started telling this story about a family dinner at a restaurant with a big extended family. And she said the doors of the restaurant were really heavy. And I thought, I don't describe a lot of my restaurant meals that way.
Yeah.
That's an interesting insight. And then she went on to say after dinner, their little guy pushed open that heavy door and ran into the parking lot. And
That's what they remember.
the rest of the family sort of, screamed because this little boy's running into a parking lot. And she and her husband looked at each other and cried. And they said, we never thought we'd have to teach him not to run into a parking lot.
Oh.
And it just gives me chill.
Yeah.
And it's what you're saying that, there's a lot of hidden learnings in all of these stories. And it's really, if we can amplify those, you'll never forget the Singap family that said fear of seizure is their biggest hurdle.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this work is so purposeful and meaningful. I had an experience in another condition called hypophosphatasia, and there's a very meaningful therapy in that disease. And a little boy was sharing how grateful he is to be treated. And at the end of his conversation, he said, but those injections really hurt. And so our science team took that back and said, wow, we can't just stop because this therapy is approved. We have to do better.
Sure.
And it's all of those pieces that sometimes come out in just genuine storytelling that drives listening.
Yeah. Well, you had talked earlier about not just stopping when we get across the finish line or whatever finish line we've set. Tell me a little bit more about this. Maybe late phase 3, phase 4, continuing to keep our pedal to the floor as patient advocates.
I think it really is. Clinical trials serve a very important purpose, but they are a point in time. They're a very specific demographic of people built around, really proving a scientific hypothesis and working as fast as possible. But if that gets across the finish line and a medicine is approved, in the real world setting, things can look and will look a lot different. So continuing to learn is very, very important. And then arc of sharing that back with the people that have the most to gain or lose is so important. And I'm just not sure we've built the system to do that.
Sure.
We've talked so much about getting patient input to protocol design and outcomes. And, we still have work to do, don't get me wrong. But that almost feels like low-hanging fruit to me now.
Sure.
And it's this later timing around what are we still learning, what real world evidence is coming in. It's all on the backs of families and people taking risk and making very important life decisions about treatment. So we owe it to them to come back and have that effective, clear, well communicated scientific information.
Yeah. And obviously, as you make moves with those products internally, you start engaging with new teams in industry. And I would imagine market access, which are for those of you who are listening that might not be aware, market access are the ones that are responsible for trying to ensure that product is available on formularies and approved by different insurance companies, including the government. You have your commercial teams that are out there trying to ensure that different doctors know about the product, but they might not be aware of all of the work that's gone into it and all that you've learned from patient advocates. How do you describe to those teams the benefit of sitting and as I like to say, you have to go slow. I heard you say this before too. You have to go slow before you can go fast.
And I think you have to really come to the table setting that foundational landscape of,
Mm,
this is what we've learned, this is who we know, this is why this matters. But I think there's a really important kind of practical step in the middle of all this, which I always call warm transfer. So
there you go. Yeah.
I see in patient advocacy as this central point of connection, not the only point and not the gatekeeper or the yes no people, but we really are the central point. And the reason that's so important is we're unilaterally focused on making sure families we engage have an exquisite experience. And what does that look like for them? And who needs to drive that? But we're that red thread through this whole arc of experience.
Yeah.
And so, as much as we can warm transfer, I have people reach out proactively and say, I want to be in your brochure. I want to be the spokesperson. I want to share my story. So, making sure we're handling the relationship piece and introducing people and letting them know what to expect for all the right reasons. We're a very regulatory driven industry with the utmost of ethics and compliance. So some things may not make sense to families.
Sure. Yeah.
Taking the time to explain that and really making sure their questions are answered is such an important step.
Yeah. No, it's great that you place that out there for everyone to recognize, which is that some of the things that are done by industry are done not because we want to do them. It's because the federal government have mandated that we do them. And
protect at the end of the day, to protect
them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, you talk a lot about this trust build that has taken place. What are the risks of not continuing that red thread from phase 0 through phase 4? What risks do you see?
I think that those are really tangible and palpable. The sad truth of our business is most drug development programs fail.
Yeah.
We accept a high rate of failure. The probability of technical success in drug development is a very small percentage. So just with that data alone, why wouldn't we be preparing for all outcomes? What I've seen is when a program is not moving forward for whatever reason, whether it's clinical failure, prioritization, lack of investment, whatever it is, internally, there are all these teams working almost like on a hamster wheel for these programs. But if that crossroads happens where something isn't going forward, if you have 30 people working on a program on Tuesday and that decision is made, on Wednesday, you might have 4. I mean, it is that dramatic. And so the red thread is really being prepared for that. I worked on a program that had actually gone into phase 3 for a rare neurodegenerative disease. And Matt, when I tell you, I was talking to patients every day for whom, in their experience, this drug was having significant benefit.
It worked for them. Yeah.
When we did the data readout, it was one of the most beautiful trial failures I've ever seen. The placebo and drug curve were superimposed. It was very clear that drug did not work. So we actually had built into our process, despite the fact that we were sure that this was moving forward, this wind down time. Anybody that wanted to talk to us had direct access to the patient advocacy team, so we could really walk them through the data. We also had very clear timelines on what this meant for them. We did a webinar for the community to walk through the failed study. And then we had a very, very significant amount of work where we committed to sharing data and information back. But that was all planned. So when this happened, it wasn't, okay, what do we do now? It was really part of the plan as much as planning was part of the plan. So I think that's really important. And then I think if you do have that success and a drug is approved, being prepared to talk about what that means. So the release goes out, access could be months, it could be not for everybody. The label really drives that. So having that conversation around, this is the approved label. Here's what that means. Here are the people that can support you in insurance understanding and access, and walking people through that, because it is, again, another complexity, but we
Yeah.
don't want to that everyone has the information.
Yeah, I would almost equate it to when you get approval, now you're almost entering a minefield at times, right? Where when you didn't have approval, you might have had a bunch of different trials and different endpoints, and it was a bit more open, maybe perhaps for different patient types. But then once you get that label, things get really tight, and the federal government steps in, and regulatory, all for good reasons, to ensure that this is the right drug, as they say in industry all the time, the right drug for the right patient at the right time. But that can leave a lot of people wanting more. And I think
Another bout of a whole new language.
yes,
So these
whole new
families
language.
learn what words to use and who to talk to.
And I think what you lay out here that I got goosebumps ultimately from was the built-in wind down time. Because I can't tell you the number of times doing that market research that I do to understand the relationship between the nonprofits and industry, where we hear, man, they just ghosted me, or they shut down the product. They did it publicly, but they didn't talk to us about it. So these teams didn't have that built-in wind down time. And then it was lights out, right? As you referenced, people may go from 30 in a team to 4, and no one was there to answer the phones. So I love that you as your teams are building these plans, you're thinking about all options, because as you referenced all the way back at the beginning, at the other side of that product is a patient, is a family who have made that commitment to your company and your product, not just to themselves to get that product that they feel is right, but to participate in a trial, as rigorous as it may be, and they deserve that right to make that phone call to you. So I love that you have set that up. But I want to bring us to that new language. And it seems like that new language in the payer space is ever expanding, with MFP and MFN and all of the fun that comes with access challenges. A lot of what we've seen in our data is a desire to get back to coalitions. And I wanted to get your thoughts on where coalitions best serve patients as we think about going to the FDA or lobbying on behalf of patients, rather than, as you referenced, some of these rare disease groups are very, very small and just don't have that capability. Perhaps we need to allow them or coach them to work with others. What are your thoughts as we come to that?
Matt, I think it really is about what are the collective opportunities, and then people lean in where they feel most impassioned and most powerful. And, there are people who have gone through their own experience and want to advocate for policy for others. There are others who want to throw the pizza party and raise awareness, and it takes everybody.
Yes.
I also think one of the core pieces of this that we really need to remember is the only person in this whole ecosystem of stakeholders that we keep talking about that's a volunteer is the patient. They didn't go to school.
Great point.
Didn't seek this out because this is what they wanted to do for their lives. They are thrust into this role through what might arguably be one of the most devastating times of their lives. And so if we get back to many patient advocacy groups are volunteer-led and run, we can't have the same expectations them in how they organize and the work they do and where they focus. We have to ask them what their and then where can we help fill in the gaps. And if we take the time to do that, we find the right people to partner with and the right initiatives that are mutually beneficial. One isn't more important than another.
Sure. Yeah.
And that takes time. And again, it takes patient advocacy expertise. It takes really bringing that group together to understand what the broader ecosystem is.
I love that, because as you referenced, not everyone has the desire to go knock on doors at Capitol Hill. Some, as you referenced, want to put on that carnival in fourth grade to raise awareness and funds, and that's what they're called to do. Right. Everyone has a different calling, and everyone has different skills. So I love that you recognize that, but at the same time, want to help fill those voids where necessary. My last question for you, as you think about your career, where you've been, where you're going, if you could talk to your 20-year-old self, going back, I mean, your boys now are in their early 20s, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah.
What would you, perhaps you've told this to them, but what would you tell yourself? You said you had found your passion early, which God bless you for finding it that young and for wanting to get involved. But what have you learned that maybe you'd want to tell your 20-year-old self at that point that would help you that much more now?
Wow, that's feels like a really heavy question.
Yeah.
And I go back to really being open to taking chances and not thinking I can't do that, but what if I can?
Yeah.
And, in some tangible ways, I graduated from college in Ohio and moved to Pennsylvania for my first job. And a year and a half later, had an opportunity to go to San Francisco and
Where'd you go in Ohio? I got to ask.
Miami of Ohio.
Okay. You're Miami of Ohio. I'm Ohio State. Got it.
The Ohio State.
That's right.
I jumped at it and I went to San Francisco and I just think that set me up on this trajectory of, wait, I can try this. I can do this. I can contribute. And so that really is important in how I'm telling my kids to think about the opportunities in front of them and
Yeah.
look left and right and keep up with others. But what do you want to do? Where can you contribute most? And we talk a lot about giving back and how important that is. Then someone said to me really early on, and he was a CEO of a fairly large pharma company at the time. And he said, let the people most affected lead the conversation. And I think those words, because I didn't realize the impact they were going to have later. But what I took that to mean was my role isn't to speak for others, but to create the space where more voices can join the table. And this came from somebody who was leading a really big organization. And that same day, someone said to me, oh, I saw you talking to him. Were you nervous? And I wasn't. I had this sense of, I want to soak this up. What can I?
Yeah. I love that because, back when I was 20, I just broken my neck, and
Yeah.
I love that mindset though of just imagine what could be, not that it can't. And when I look back now at finally getting that fixed at 38, and I wish I had the words of like, just keep fighting. There's another side to it.
Or what you couldn't see what was coming, but believing that it was going to be okay.
Exactly. But you're a true advocate because you are putting people in a position to share their power and to utilize their voice. And that's what I've always looked at you for as a leader in this entire industry and doing. And I thank you for that, because without you, God knows where the advocacy role would be, quite frankly. We still have a lot to do and a lot of systems to develop, as you referenced, but we're in a great spot right now. If we can get leaders that are new to those roles to recognize that value.
I agree. And I think you're creating the space, but more importantly, you're researching and creating the data for us to use that continues to show the value.
That's our goal, is to allow advocates to fight internally with the data as much as we can. And at the end of the day, ensure that we are always looking down at or looking back at all of the patients, because at one point we all need help. At some point, we're all going to need it. And we want people that are going to be there to lift us up. And that's what I love about this advocacy function, and why I built this podcast, is so that people recognize that there are voices in all areas of this healthcare maze that we find ourselves in. As an advocate friend of mine says, healthcare is the Home Depot you get dropped into that you never wanted to shop at. But there are no experts in the aisle. You're just kind of trying to figure it out for yourself and hope that you buy the right thing. But when there are folks like yourself and there are advocates at the table and there are people that are there to help guide, but more importantly, allow them to recognize that their voice still matters in this fight, that they don't have to be quiet. They don't have to take the first diagnosis or treatment for yes. I think that we'll all be in a better spot. So I appreciate your time. Wendy,
Thank
final
you.
statement from you.
Just use the word fight. And I don't think we should shy away from that. It is a fight, but it's the right fight. I describe this work as pushing a bucket of water uphill. And whatever little bit I can get to the top, it's our responsibility to go back down, fill it up, and keep going, because that's right. The respect of these families.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for your time today. And we'll be in touch shortly.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.